Welcome. Good to see you here. In 2002, Andrew Solomon published a book called The Noonday Demon. It was the story of, in fact, a history of depression, but it was much more. It was Andrew Solomon's searingly personal struggle with his own depression, The Noonday Demon. It won a National Book Award. Shortly after its publication, I interviewed Mr. Salon on the Sunday edition. In the days and weeks after that broadcast, we received more mail than any other story or interview we had aired up to that time. Now, Andrew Solomon has done it again. In Far From the Tree, he explores the idea of difference through the experiences of families whose children are marked in some way by disability, or what we choose to call a disability, whether it's schizophrenia, deafness, dwarfism, autism, Down syndrome, and so on. He also looks at the phenomenon of the child prodigy. It is a monumental work. The New York Times has called it a lion-hearted book. I like that description. And went on to say that this book shoots arrow after arrow into your heart. Andrew Solomon is multi-talented. He studied at Yale and Cambridge University and is an expert on Russian art. He is also an award-winning journalist and an accomplished novelist. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Solomon. Welcome.
What a pleasure to be here.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Before we get into the matter of the book, there's a very serious question I have. What significance should we read into the fact that you have a canary called Barack?
New York Times recently reported on that.
Indeed.
We were sitting at home one day with a window open, and he flew in the window. And we looked at him, and at the time, our son was only 2 years old, and he could only pronounce words that started with B. Book, ball, and we tried to think of something else that went with it. And we had a moment of inspiration. Enthusiasts for the president as we were, we went with Barack.
And what about your cat, Romney?
He was put to sleep about a month ago.
The cliche is the apple doesn't fall from the tree. Tell me about the title, Far From the Tree.
So the idea is that the apple and the tree represent the parent and the child, and that in general we say that parents very much resemble their children. People expect to have children who resemble them. You say, oh, look at that, he's an athlete just like Dad, or whatever it is. I wanted to write about the experiences of people who are really dramatically different from their parents, and the experiences of parents who have children who are dramatically different from them. What's it like when the apple falls 2 orchards away or halfway around the world?
What do you take from the word different? When I say different, what do you take it to mean?
I think the word different is it's become a very loaded word. You mentioned the name of the canary, so I'll allow myself to wax political for a second and say that I really felt in this election that if you were watching the election in the US, if you were watching on the television what was happening, there was the room of Romney supporters who all either looked the same or looked like they were trying to look the same. And there was the room of Obama supporters who looked unbelievably diffuse and diverse, and I think that that's the direction for us all to move toward. Thanks. And I really see difference as being something, there's an old idea that difference is very isolating, and when I was working on this book and meeting people who were different in various ways, individual differences are very isolating. There are only so many schizophrenics, there are only so many people who are transgender, there are only so many people who have any of a variety of other characteristics. But if we assume that everyone who experiences himself as somehow different from the mainstream has something in common, that's more people than there are in the mainstream itself.
Then why do we fear difference so much?
I think that there's somehow the idea that if we tolerate difference, that the people who seem safe and solid and like the ones who are running the show will be undermined. And I think, on the contrary, that if we tolerate difference, that what we're doing is opening and expanding our idea of humanity rather than somehow limiting it. There's this idea somehow that normality is this rare and precious thing that a small group of people can lay claim to, and that they're the ones who are in charge. And I think threats to that are threats to the social order.
But that doesn't speak to the fear. I mean, it's almost an inchoate fear that we have of people who look differently from us, however you define the norm, or talk or walk differently. I don't know how we explain or get over the fear that you're talking about.
I think the best way to get over the fear is through exposure. I mean, I have to say that when I started working on this book, I was actually somewhere between afraid of and uncomfortable with people in most of the categories I was looking at. I was ill at ease with various kinds of disability. I thought that people who were transgender were very disorienting and disconcerting. A lot of it felt and looked strange to me. And then I got to know people, and I got to hear the stories of these people. And with that exposure, I felt the sort of glowing humanity and the embrace of these people, and that was a very transformative experience, and it's the one I've tried to recreate in the book.
I want to go back to the genesis of the project. You wrote a magazine piece in 1994 about deafness. How did you approach that, and why did that suddenly set a spark alight?
So my editor at the New York Times Magazine, who was the person who gave me that assignment, said, I had been doing a lot of foreign reporting. You mentioned the Russian artists earlier. And he said, you've done a good job of penetrating many rather difficult foreign cultures. He said, I'm of the impression that this is a foreign culture within our own society, and I wonder whether you'll be able to get inside it. And I, at the time, I knew nothing about deafness. I thought, those poor people, they can't hear. What a shame. If only we could help them all to hear. And then I went off and started meeting deaf people, and I realized that there is a whole deaf culture. It's organized around the use of sign language, which is, I think, its central defining quality. But many of the deaf people I met didn't experience themselves primarily as lacking hearing, but rather as having membership in a culture that was a very good and valid culture in their view. And I became very interested in those cultural models and very interested in trying to understand a culture of deafness. And I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that they frequently have parents who think the best way for them to be happy is for them to learn lip reading and oral speech, and that many of them then discovered the deaf culture in adolescence. And when I was writing about it, I thought, my God, it's just like the gay kids of straight parents, which is my difference category, or one of my difference categories. It felt very familiar.
Yes, sorry.
Scratching here.
Oh, the microphone was...
No.
Andrew's wearing a tie with little tiny monkeys on it.
Thank you.
I won't be exploring that this evening. The other word I wanted to ask you about, in addition to difference, is identity. Because I'm curious to know the people and the parents in the book. Is their identity defined and circumscribed by the disability?
So I became very interested again in working on the book on the tension between the ideas of illness and identity. When I was about 5 years old, there was an article in Time magazine, at that point the voice of the mainstream in my country, which said of homosexuality that it was a pitiable flight from reality, a pathetic second-rate substitute for life that deserved no glamorization as anything but a pernicious sickness.
Not to mention a sin.
That was indeed, and a crime, by the way. But that was the view of homosexuality then. And in the life that I now lead with a husband and children, homosexuality seems to me, or gayness seems to me to be an identity. And I thought, if I could make or if people like me could make that switch from an illness to an identity model, then where else was that switch possible? And when I went into the deaf culture, I thought, okay, there are aspects of deafness that feel like illness, and there are aspects that feel like identity. And as I continued working, I thought, you can experience almost any characteristic as an illness or as an identity. There is a possibility of experiencing your race, your age, your ethnicity, all of those things as illnesses. They all, in some ways, impede your ability to do certain things in certain contexts under certain sets of rules. And at the same time, you can take things that we think of as being clearly just horrific, like being someone who commits crimes. We can experience that as an identity. It doesn't mean it's a desirable identity. Not all identity needs to be lauded and praised, but being a criminal is an identity too.
You talk about a vertical identity and a horizontal identity. What's the difference?
So a vertical identity is an identity which is passed down generationally. Your ethnicity is usually a vertical identity. Your nationality is usually a vertical identity.
Color? Your color?
Yes. And so you have the sense that all of these things are passed from generation to generation vertically. A horizontal identity occurs when your parents are suddenly confronted with a child who is effectively a member of a culture with which they have no previous experience. And so you grow up and you're gay or you're deaf or you're a dwarf or you're any of the many other things that I looked at, and you have to learn identity from your peer group. So I've said that's the sort of horizontal effect.
When you started talking to the family, and I should point out this was a 10-year project.
Yes.
You wound up with 40,000 pages of transcribed interviews. Is that right?
Yes.
When you started talking to the families, first of all, how did you choose them? And in the choosing, how did they respond to your questions?
So the process of choosing was kind of gradual and complicated. I looked at many different categories. I ended up narrowing things down to 10 because it's quite a chunky book as it is, and I couldn't make it, an encyclopedia. But the families I found through a whole variety of means, sometimes because I sat and talked to someone and they said, you have to talk to my sister, she's been dealing with this exact thing. And sometimes because I had posted an ad on the internet. When I was working on crime, I took a job for a while working in a juvenile facility so that I could meet young offenders and talk to their families. And as I approached them, what I found was that most of these people felt very lonely in their experiences. And they
isolated from each other or isolated from the community in which they lived?
Many of them isolated even from the community of the syndrome that they shared in common with others. But almost all of them isolated from everyone except the people with whom they shared whatever that syndrome or condition was. And a lot of them felt, they said over and over and over again, families said, if I can tell this story, and that will mean that another mother doesn't feel as alone as I felt when I found out my child had Down syndrome or whatever it is. If I can tell my story and it will mean that other people who have autism know that there are other people like them out there and that we have some value, then I'm willing to discuss even the most painful things because I would so much like to spare other people that difficulty.
But you point out in the book that, for example, the parents of a child with Down syndrome think to themselves they have nothing in common with someone suffering from dwarfism,
right,
or schizophrenia, or autism. So they're categories of disability. Are there hierarchies of disability? This is the worst. This is not the worst.
It's always a very interesting question. I got asked it over and over again. Which of these conditions would you? No. Which of these conditions would you most hate to have? In the first place, I think which condition is hardest depends on which person it affects. I think there are people who are better able to deal with certain syndromes than with others. But I also think that the experience of habit makes these situations very different from the way they are when you imagine them from outside. So I, for example, feel that if I lost all of my hearing right now, I would have a very hard time with it. But I think if I had grown up as a deaf person using sign language, that I would have a different identity, and within that identity, I might not have quite as difficult a time with it. So it's hard to say.
But would you be defined as a deaf person? And in other words, whatever your personality is as Andrew Salon, but you would be, first of all, recognized and defined as a deaf person.
First of all, I think is always a question. I mean, I'm a depressive, I'm a US citizen, I'm an overeducated individual, or whatever I am.
Right.
So I'm gay. I mean, they're all parts of identity.
Dyslexic.
But I think, dyslexic, yes, I'm certainly that. I think that as you'll discover if you ask me to sign a book later, but I think that that experience of identity, I think all of these are very central identities. And I think it's impossible to take someone, for example, who is autistic and say, but wouldn't you like him better if he were not autistic? I mean, there's an autism activist who said he said, addressing parents in general, when you wish that we were not autistic, what you're really wishing is that we would die and strangers you can love would move in behind our faces. It's a very confrontational way of putting it, but these characteristics are inherent to someone's whole personality. You can't sort of cordon them off.
Yeah. Was there one, and I don't want to use the word syndrome, but was there one set of circumstances that you found almost overwhelming, almost to the point where you couldn't go on with the interview or you couldn't deal with what the parents were dealing with? And so it was just something that just got, as the Times said, that shot an arrow into your heart.
Right. So there were episodes that shot arrows into my heart in every chapter and in every category I looked at. But I think the two things that seemed to me hardest were, from the sort of purely disease standpoint, schizophrenia, and from the complex issues of identity standpoint, I have a chapter on families bringing up children conceived in rape. And the stories of what those families had gone through were particularly, and especially what those women had gone through, were particularly horrifying. And schizophrenia was horrifying, even though for some people it's treatable because it sets in so late. So if you have someone with autism and you try to imagine that person without autism, you're imagining, as the quotation I gave a moment ago indicates, a different person. If you have someone with schizophrenia and you're trying to imagine the person without schizophrenia, you're probably imagining them as who they were for the first 2 decades of their life. And that, I think, inflects the entire experience of the disease.
Why did you include the children of rape victims and the children of criminals?
So it's the children of rape victims, children conceived in rape, and then children who are themselves criminals rather than children of criminals. But the idea was that that this experience of having a child who appears to be so alien as to be unlovable can inhere not only in the genetic situation of that child or the illness situation of that child, but also in the circumstances from which the child arose or in the things that the child, apparently with volition, has elected to do. That those experiences also really blur quite significantly with the experience of other disabilities and of other strengths, because prodigies are in there too.
Is there a difference, either medically or in your own mind, between a disability and a disorder?
The vocabulary around all of these questions has become very politicized. So there's always a word that's fashionable and a word that's unfashionable. At the moment, the disability rights movement has effectively reclaimed the label of disability and has said that while disabilities require accommodation, there also can be strength, they also can have cultural significance, and has said that a lot of what we experience as disability is socially constructed. So if you have someone who can't move his legs, that's a disorder. But if that person can't get into the library because he can't move his legs, that's a disability that's been imposed by the social system. So disorder seems to me a little more punitive and a little more medicalizing, and disability a little more cultural.
But you see, I guess the phrase is the abled community, I'm not sure, are very slow to, or hesitant to suggest something is or is not a disability. For example, as you know, in the DSM, the psychiatric manual years ago, homosexuality was a disability.
Right.
Or a disorder even. And you say as an adult, you're defined to some extent by the fact that you're gay. So does that mean that you had a disability and it's now society has outgrown it, or you've outgrown what does that mean?
Well, I'd like to think we've all outgrown
yes.
it. But I think that the point that I most wanted to make is just that these things change. So I could say to you what seems to me to be a disability right now But 10 years from now, some of those things might not seem like disabilities anymore. And some of the things that are generally understood to be illnesses might come to be seen as identities instead. It's the fluidity of it that I wanted to capture. I can't say where it's going. I can't say, in 100 years, the attitude will be completely different in this specific way. I can just say it's all likely to be in flux.
You said that there's a tendency or perhaps a danger of politicizing the whole area. How does that manifest itself? I mean, people talk about being differently abled and all of that. We like to euphemize things, I think. I have a very close friend who is blind, has been blind from his teenage years, but he's sight impaired. No, he's not. He's stone blind.
Right.
And I'm wondering how we are to cope with the differing and varying descriptions of disability.
Yeah. I mean, the movement toward differently abled was very much what was happening when I was a bit younger, and a friend of mine suggested when she was in a bad mood that she was just differently agreeable. I think we can all run with that one. I think that the point with all of these shifts in vocabulary, which easily become ludicrous and are subject to caricature, is that they should be respectful of people's difference rather than disparaging. And I think it's the intent that lies behind the words more than the words that are actually used. I, for instance, got into a lot of discussion. Dwarfs or little people don't like to be called midgets because it's a circus term. And in fact, if you look at the etymology, you can see why people would object to it. It comes from the sort of small, annoying insects that fly around in summertime. Midges, exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I knew people who were dwarfs who said that they had been incredibly hurt by someone's using that word. And I said, but the person who was using it didn't know it was disparaging. And in that instance, I don't think it really constitutes an attack. So people get much too rigid about this. The question really is, are you describing people in a way that seems to denigrate them? Or are you describing people in a way that seems to allow them some dignity?
That was one of the stunning things about the book. You went to a conference of Little People of America.
Yes.
And I must confess that I probably was suckered in by the caricature of the midget, the dwarf. And there's an operation that called a leg lengthening operation or something that parents could have. It sounded something out of the medieval, the rack or something, the Spanish Inquisition.